Rising electricity demand from artificial intelligence, electrification, and economic growth is putting America's power grid at a critical turning point. How we plan and build today will shape our energy future for decades to come. Policymakers are trying to keep up, but how do we ensure that in meeting this moment, we don't repeat the mistakes of the past? You're listening to Energy Solutions, a podcast from the Electric Power Supply Association, where we unpack the stories and trends behind America's power grid. I'm your host, Todd Snitchler, President and CEO of EPSA. In this episode, I sit down with David Hill, Executive Vice President of the Bipartisan Policy Center's Energy Program and Vice Chairman of the Board of Directors of the New York Independent System Operator. David is also former General Counsel at the U.S. Department of Energy. We talk about how to balance ambitious policy goals with practical solutions, why transparent and accurate data is important for ISOs, and how permitting reform can help meet growing demand. Perhaps most importantly, we cover how we can plan for high-demand, high-uncertainty futures, and how to avoid overbuilding the wrong things and placing the risk on consumers. David reminds us there are no facts about the future, but what we do today, in policy, in markets, and investment, will shape our ability to meet rising demand with reliable infrastructure and protect consumers from costly mistakes. Here's David. Well, David, thank you for taking an opportunity to visit with us here on Energy Solutions. We're delighted to have you join us. And we've got a lot of ground to cover. And so we're going to jump right in and start with the big picture, and perhaps we'll drill down from there. So how do you see the current moment in electricity policy and infrastructure planning? Is it a different scenario this time? Have you seen this movie before? Or are there parallels maybe to previous inflection points? You know, that old adage about history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. What's your perspective given your long career in the energy industry?
Well, Todd, and first of all, it's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I will say that it seems to me that one of the defining characteristics of our current time is uncertainty. When I was at the Department of Energy a number of years ago, one of my colleagues would always say, there are no facts about the future. When somebody had made a statement with great certainty about something that was going to happen, and he would kind of lean back in his chair and say that. But I think right now, we have a situation where there are very high degrees of uncertainty about a lot of different things, about how much load growth we're going to see, about how technology is going to develop, about how policy is going to develop. And so it seems as if really uncertainty is kind of the defining word of the time in the electric power space.
It does seem to be the order of the day. And you, I think, hit on some of the things that our sector, but all of the energy value chain is thinking about with regard to uncertainty, about as much of the how much as the when. I mean, there's all sorts of predictions. You've seen all the same reports that we have that show load growth numbers, some of which are pretty amazing, some of which are pretty startling. And I'm not sure what anybody knows is the right answer, but I think it does resonate with your point about uncertainty. So as we think about it, it really kind of raises the question about overbuilding or the possibility of overbuilding and what that might mean when we look at what consumers are going to ultimately pay for some of this. And that's true across the entire electricity value chain. It's not just generation. So I think you've said it, and I referenced it before we started here. We've seen this movie before. As you look back over your career, what are some of the biggest lessons that you think policymakers today should be taking from lessons that we've learned from prior experience as we think about ramping up capacity quickly, or really if we want to boil it down to overbuilding and consumer risk? How do you think about that given your experience?
I think, Todd, that when we look at our current situation and we think about the uncertainty that we have today, we can look at history and try to learn from it, but also realize the future is not going to be an exact repeat of the past. Right. And so how is it that we draw lessons from history, but at the same time realize that things are different in different ways now? I think when we look at the past, and particularly if we look back at the 80s, going into the 90s, we had a situation where there was significant overbuilding, and there was overbuilding of generation, and there were some wrong guesses and estimates about how technology was going to develop, how the price of different fuels. I don't know that anybody was guessing that the price of natural gas was going to drop like a rock, that the natural gas was going to be produced in the United States the way that it was even then, and certainly not the way that it is produced today. Nobody was predicting that, I don't think. And so we had a situation where we did have a lot of generation overbuild, and not the kind of generation necessarily that folks would pick once things developed as they did. I think You touched on the issue of overbuilding, and one of the of course most important and most complex parts about running the power system is there are significant downsides, very important downsides to overbuilding. There are very significant downsides to underbuilding. And so how do we actually hit the right zone in terms of what it is we're building? I should say that one of the things, and I don't know if you knew this, Todd, but actually the very first matter I worked on in the electric power business 30 years ago was representing Pennsylvania Power and Light Company in a contract case, and Jersey Central Power and Light was on the other side of the case. It was a contract dispute over the sale of the output of one of the two units at the Susquehanna nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania. And the reason there was even a sale between those two utilities was because the Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission had decided that they weren't going to allow that plant and the cost to be passed through to customers in the state. So it's just a situation where things can develop in unpredictable ways and can lead to some very difficult issues that have to be addressed.
Yeah, that's a great example. As you think about it, how do we balance policy ambitions with market discipline? I mean, some have said our sector is not the greatest at the objective of capital deployment, but at the same time, I think we have certainly sharpened our pencils and gotten much better at capital deployment over time. And our utility cousins have the same obligation to be smart about the investments that they make, whether it's generation or wires, transmission or distribution. But the issue always comes down to consumers. And how do we make sure consumers are protected from some of the risks of overbuild, regardless of which segment of the system? How do you think about balancing the need to get it right? Because we all want to get it right. Reliability is paramount. But as you noted, over and underbuilding both have sets of risks. How do you think about that? Or how should policymakers think about it?
Well, it's a very difficult set of challenges. I think there has to be a real premium placed on planning, analysis, on real transparency about how the system is being planned, what the potential risks are of being wrong about any of it, and who is going to bear the consequences of those risks, both in terms of reliability and cost and environmental outcomes. There really is no substitute for careful analysis and careful planning, with the recognition, of course, that even within that, there will be mistakes made or guesses or estimates that turn out to be wrong.
Yeah, I think the issue that we talked about a little bit with some other guests that we've had in the podcast is this load forecasting question, which I think certainly one of the areas that I think you were referencing in your comments is if we get that wrong, then the potential for bad investments across the board goes up perhaps exponentially, and avoid that.
Yeah, and I think there's been a lot of emphasis recently on load forecasting, and I do think that's something that can always be improved. But by the same token, it's also something that shouldn't be viewed as the thing that is always blamed for the fact that something has turned out in a way we didn't predict. There's only so much we can do to plan and to estimate how the future will turn out. And we know those estimates are going to be wrong. We just don't know how much they're going to be wrong, when they're going to be wrong, and sort of which way they're going to be wrong. And so I think there is a lot, and you touched upon this with your question about how it is we take into account the risks and really the difficulty of planning. We really got to focus attention on who does bear that financial risk of being wrong. That's an important question that sometimes I don't think we pay enough attention to.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so I'd be remiss if I didn't address the current headlines that we're seeing, since we're talking about costs and all those things, and the developments surrounding energy prices, and of course, all the attention being paid to PJM's market in particular. I don't know if you had the chance to observe or read any of the coverage of the takeaways from the recent conference held by the governors in Philadelphia, but I'm curious if you had any takeaways or things that stood out to you as important points, good, bad, or indifferent, as part of the discussion over the course of the day.
Yes, I actually attended the conference there in Philadelphia. I was there for the whole thing, and I thought it was a really interesting meeting. You know, one takeaway from it is, and maybe I particularly think about that, about this point being at the Bipartisan Policy Center, it was crystal clear that energy prices and energy affordability is a bipartisan concern.
We'd agree.
You had 4 governors there. Governor Shapiro was there in person, but you had 3 other governors that spoke: Governor Youngkin, Governor Moore, and Governor Murphy. And so you had a very strong bipartisan expression of concern. Now, the thing about that is, to me, that also is something that cries out for bipartisan solutions. I mean, one of the things, anytime we have big problems, obviously, there's always an effort to figure out how to place blame.
Right.
And some of that is inevitable in the political sphere, and I get that. But what we really need to be focused on are what are the right solutions to it? What can we do to address it? And it does seem to me, certainly, there are some bipartisan solutions and that there are some things that should get broad support all the way across the spectrum for how to address some of those things.
Yeah, and I think the stakeholders, if they didn't beforehand, certainly understand now that there has been sharp attention drawn to these issues. I expect that'll get people thinking harder about solutions, and we're optimistic that we'll find a workable pathway forward that ultimately is going to continue to keep the benefits of participation in the PJM marketplace, but also respond to the world that we live in and energy costs that are rising and how we think about the best ways to manage them and how are we going to make sure that consumers ultimately are not left paying the bill for things that either are not prudent investments or are, as we've been talking about, situations that are overbuilding. It was interesting as I listened to the conference, there was a few threats about, well, competitive markets may not be delivering value. Should we think about leaving the market? What should we do? Maybe utilities need to get back in the generation game. I'm kind of curious again from the Bipartisan Policy Center perspective, but also your work career, having been at DOE, having worked for an IPP, having done all kinds of things in the energy space. What's the long view of history tell you about some of those comments and observations?
Well, so I have lots of answers or lots of comments in response to that. I will say that the whole subject of whether or not we should have a market or not, to me, we're going to have a market. The only question is, what are we going to have a market for? Are we going to have a market for capacity and energy? Are we going to have a market for political influence? Are we going to have a market for control about how it is that people are going to express that over their regulators? I mean, what is an election but a market for voters? Do you have politicians trying to appeal to voters and really market themselves to them in whatever way they can? I think that what we have right now within PJM, it's a very tough set of challenges because you see load growth happening and in very big chunks with the data centers. So it's not as if it just is gradually increasing. You've got very big new loads coming onto the system. You have increased building electrification. You have more electric vehicles. You have more electrification of homes. You have population growth. So it's coming from a whole number of different things. And so it's a lot of very tough challenges to meet those demands. And yet we want to meet them. We don't want to actually shut off any of those uses. We want that demand to grow. We want the economy to grow. I think it's critically important that we ensure our AI capability can grow. I mean, that's really important to ensure the United States can compete with China. China's not going to wait. So the United States needs to go. We need to go. And in order to go, we need to actually make sure it can be powered. The challenges in PJM are difficult, but there's no reason they can't be met. You asked as well, Todd, the whole issue of how the states might respond to that. I think there are great benefits to the market and there are great benefits to regionalization. And so I think there's every reason to believe that everybody stays in PJM, but that's not to say that processes couldn't be improved.
Sure. I think everybody, even PJM, would probably agree with that sentiment. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about natural gas, because that is one of the things that I think is helping to drive some of the value, but it's also one of the issues that we're trying to wrestle with and figure out what that's going to look like in the longer term. And I know the BPC just issued a report not too long ago that you co-authored on the future of natural gas. And that report emphasizes its critical role for reliability and affordability. How do you think we should be thinking about gas in the context of the growing AI demand and the other drivers that you mentioned a moment ago, but also in combination with decarbonization goals and long lead times for alternatives? Can you kind of help us thread the needle a bit? There's a lot at play there. And it requires a little bit of deep thought to get to solutions that have long-term value.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. And I would refer everybody to the report that we issued here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. It's available on our website, bipartisanpolicy.org, so that anybody can find it. The title of the report kind of says it: The Future of Natural Gas, a Strategic Framework for Reliability, Affordability, Security, and Decarbonization. It actually is possible for these things to be addressed. And we walk through in the report some different policy ideas and different things that need to be addressed to ensure that can be done. Natural gas has a long and bright future in the United States. And United States gas has a long and bright future in the world. Part of the reason it does is because of the way that the United States produces it in an environmentally responsible way. And there's always more that we could do to address that. But I think the United States producers are outstanding, and we just need to make sure that we continue to do what we can to produce our gas responsibly and ensure that we have the midstream and downstream infrastructure to get to the market.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the issues that I don't want to say it's overlooked, but maybe doesn't get the attention that it needs is if we're going to continue to utilize gas and we're going to need new resources, we're going to need more linear infrastructure, and that includes pipelines to move the molecules from where they are being produced to where we're going to need to consume them.
Yeah, I think it's a really key point. And that's something that can't actually just be done over the course of a week or a month. There is a lot of planning that has to take place. Linear infrastructure, building pipelines, building electric transmission lines, building highways is a very difficult process. You go through a lot of different lands. You have to go across rivers or under them. You have to do all sorts of difficult things. And so siting linear infrastructure is very difficult. It's time consuming. And yet the natural gas potential of the United States can really only happen if we not only maintain the existing midstream interstate pipeline infrastructure that we have and downstream local networks, but also we build new. I know some people may not like that answer, but it's critically important to the energy security of the United States.
And do you think, are we sending the right signals for the markets today? And you can take this in the pipeline world, or you can take it in the power world, or both, but to make sure we're investing the right amount in that portion of the reliability component. I mean, are we missing it, or are we tracking in a direction that you think is going to provide for good outcomes?
Well, I think that it's an area that requires a lot of focused attention to make sure that we're hitting the right mark. Building linear infrastructure is incredibly expensive, and so you really do only want to take it on if the infrastructure is truly needed, and that's a whole process in itself, figuring that out and attracting the right level of capital to it. But I do think it just requires a lot of focused attention, both by the private sector, by the banks, by the regulators, to make sure that we get that right.
Your report highlighted the need to improve permitting. I think most people would agree with that sentiment. Can you share your thoughts on the current state of affairs and what you think would help improve that process or perhaps accelerate the process?
Permit reform is right at the top of the energy program agenda here at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and has been for a while. I think, though, that right now we may be at a time when the stars align for real and significant permit reform. And part of the reason for that is what we touched on earlier. Energy prices and energy costs are a significant concern, and that concern spans the political spectrum, and it spans the income spectrum, and it spans the geographic spectrum. And so within that lies the potential for a strong bipartisan solution to address a difficult problem. And permit reform is something that I think a lot of folks have thought for a long time we need to address. This could very well be our moment to do it. So here at BPC, we're optimistic that this is the time to get it done.
We too share your cautious optimism that maybe cooler heads will finally prevail and we will get a chance to see the wins that will happen on both sides of the aisle and across the energy spectrum. I mean, it's critically important.
Well, I think it's one of those things, Todd, that if you look at the numbers for any particular major infrastructure project, the amount of cost and delay that is eaten up by permit uncertainty, permit delays, and litigation surrounding permits and permitting activity. It's crazy. And it's something that really needs to be addressed for the good of the American economy and American consumers.
Yeah, I think your report also notes that about 60+% of reviews are still late. And if we're going to solve the problem, we've got to get better at it. So what can Congress realistically do, say in the next year, to change that? I know we're approaching another congressional election. The partisanship will not be turned down. It is likely to remain at sort of a fevered pitch. But if we really want to solve it, are there a couple of very specific things that make sense from your perspective?
Well, there are some bills that are currently pending up there in Congress where members on both sides of the aisle are really working hard to address different aspects of permitting. There are things that really can be addressed in a number of different statutes that would both speed up permitting, that would provide greater certainty, and that would help cut off the possibility of endless judicial reviews that go on as well.
Yeah, and I think you might be referring to the SPEED Act and the Grid Power Act, both of which I think are getting the necessary attention in Congress. And so with any luck, those will continue to move through the process and we'll see where they end up. But again, trying to meet the objectives and the timeframes and the constraints that exist in a way to help us, as you know, deal with a geopolitical issue that can't be overlooked. I mean, as you said, and I think you captured it nicely, that China's not waiting and we can't afford to get caught behind the eight ball on this.
There was just a story I saw this morning in Bloomberg, I believe it was, about how increasing power costs are hitting consumers and particularly low and middle income consumers, but hitting consumers all the way across the board. Well, a big part of the reason that's happening is because of supply and demand in the end. We've got new demand that's come on the system faster than new supply and new transmission lines. That's a problem that can't be addressed overnight. It is a problem that can be addressed. One of the important ways that you address it is through permit reform so that we can actually build the necessary infrastructure to meet demand.
It's interesting that you raised that, because one of the things we wanted to ask about is the future of nuclear. And we're seeing a lot of attention, again, bipartisan in nature, support for the nuclear fleet, both the existing and what we're going to do to invest in new resources. And it seems that the coal to nuclear opportunity is gaining some traction. So there's already sites that exist, plants are retired, you've got the connections to the wires, like a number of the criteria, the boxes are checked. So what do you think needs to change in the nuclear deployment model to make that a viable alternative?
I'll just say a couple of things on nuclear. I think nuclear has great potential. I don't think a lot of Americans know the percentage of their power that is produced today with nuclear power. It's a significant portion. And I think it really is an incredible power source. I think there are reforms that are needed to the permit system for nuclear. It takes a long, long time to get a nuclear facility permitted. And I know that the Nuclear Energy Institute has submitted a lot of comments and feedback about how that process can be improved. I think the small modular reactors also are something that has great potential, and we'll just see how they work out in the marketplace.
Yeah, I think the Nuclear Regulatory Commissioner is going to have a lot to say about how quickly those can move from the drawing board to producing electrons. And the sooner that they can be commercialized, I think all the better for ensuring an adequate rebalancing of that supply-demand equation we've been talking about. Your experience is broader than just thinking about PJM issues, which is what we spend a lot of time talking about these days. And given your leadership role on the board for New York's grid operator, the New York Independent System Operator, or NISO, as we routinely call it, I want to focus a little bit there. What are some of the top challenges facing New York's grid that perhaps our members or policymakers or other markets should pay attention to? Because PJM is not the only market that's dealing with technology changes and load growth and additions to resources. How's New York thinking about it from the NISO perspective?
No, you're absolutely right, Todd. And it's a real privilege to serve on the board of directors of the New York Independent System Operator. I'm in my 6th year on that board. And I will say, I think that the NISO is a great organization, and it's a real privilege to be a part of it. I think the challenges that New York State and the New York Independent System Operator are dealing with right now are really the same ones. They're different in details, but they're the same ones that are being dealt with in other parts of the country. Uncertainty is right at the top of the list in terms of the biggest challenge. Uncertainty about load growth, uncertainty about policy, uncertainty about what's going to happen with some of the different resources. The load is growing, reserve margins are shrinking, and the system is old. The transmission system is old. A lot of the generators are old, have been around for decades. And so it's just a number of different things that present challenges. There are different unique aspects to it in New York. And I will say that the NISO board and NISO in general, we never lose sight of the fact that the country and the world look at New York and New York City in particular. And so reliability is job one at NISO, and we never forget it.
Yeah, and you've got a great leader there in Rich Dewey, who does a terrific job running the organization. So New York also has a history of pushing the edge on energy policy, whether it's climate mandates or offshore wind goals or other choices that the legislature makes. From your seat on the board, and maybe generally also your perspective from the BPC, what lessons, good or bad, should other states or RTOs be looking at from where the NISO sits now? It's dealing with its own set of issues, but are there key takeaways that we should be looking at?
Well, I don't know that the takeaways are any different there than they would be in other parts of the country. Managing the grid is an incredibly complex and difficult job, and maintaining reliability while also ensuring it's affordable and ensuring that the environmental performance of the whole electric power system is good and always improving. That's a challenge. And so New York does have some very aggressive environmental goals these days, and that also presents its own set of challenges just in terms of managing the reliability and affordability of the system. But we at NISO, the board and the company, as well as certainly the electric power industry and the different stakeholders in the state, are doing everything they can to successfully address all those challenges.
So can I take you back to your natural gas report? And Rich Dewey has flagged his concerns over dispatchable resource retirements, particularly as demand patterns are changing now with a winter peaking system. And he famously said at one of our events, what keeps me up at night is the winter of 2032. And that's not that far away in this type of environment. I mean, really, 5 years is overnight in the planning horizons for our industry. Is the NISO or any of the other ISOs, frankly, that you have a line of sight on in danger of underinvesting in dispatchable generation? Are we addressing that concern? Are we kind of refocusing on it? Or is that a real concern that we need to be paying even sharper attention to because 2032 is right around the corner?
Well, I'd say just to begin with that it's important to know and to recognize that NISO itself doesn't do the investing. That, of course, is the developers, the different generators, the utilities, and obviously the financial institutions that back those investments. Those are the ones who are making the investing decisions and who are actually investing in the facilities. What can NISO do? I think what the New York ISO can best do, and which we concentrate on all the time, is making sure that it is a trusted source of information, that it is a reliable source of information, and that it conducts fact-based and sound analysis about the future and its different planning studies, and that it operates the bulk transmission system and the wholesale power market in the most reliable, effective way possible, and doing everything that it can to make sure that it meets those objectives. I think the analysis and the planning studies are the most important thing to accomplish the objective that you are touching on, because it's with that sort of information that the right investment decisions can be made.
Yeah, data is an incredible motivator. When you have the right data, then you can make really informed decisions. And I think that leads to much better outcomes.
And different investors and different developers can come to different conclusions
That's right.
about what they want to do. And that's fine. And it goes back to a market. Different folks have different risk tolerances. They have different investing parameters. But within that, if you have a trusted source of information and you have a market that's as transparent as you can make it, well, then you get an efficient allocation of capital and you get hopefully the best outcome for consumers.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to ask you for a little bit of personal insight from your experience and drawing from your time at DOE and at NRG. What's the hardest challenge that you find sitting at the intersection of energy, the business obligations or the business requirements that you have, and federal policy? Is there one or two things that you can point to say, boy, if I could solve that, my job would have been a heck of a lot easier?
I guess I would say the hardest thing is the balance, recognizing that there are various objectives to be met. They all need to be met all at the same time, and they have to be balanced. Here at BPC, we talk about how good energy policy focuses on what we want is reliable, affordable, clean.
Yeah.
And we want all of those. We don't just want one. When you concentrate on one and you sacrifice the others, it's not to the benefit of consumers, not to the benefit of the public, not to the benefit of the economy. You want reliable, affordable, clean, and you want to optimize for all of them. And so I think the hardest challenge is the balance, because some of the time you have to make some difficult trade-offs.
If you're advising a current or future administration, what would your first priority be? And this is to try and address the concerns that you just identified. I mean, this is the largest machine in the world that has to operate with very tight tolerances 24/7, 365. So as you think about that, what's your first priority if you're advising a future administration?
So I think that government officials in general, and of course I think about ones in the energy and environmental area most, but it's true of any of them, the advice that I would give them, first of all, is remember that you serve the public interest.
Mm-hmm.
You serve the public interest, and that is the whole public interest, the whole public, and not to be captured by any particular interest, technology, whatever it might be. Let the advocates advocate. Your job is to look out for the whole public interest.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when it comes to the power sector and the energy industry and the energy sector of the economy overall, again, if we look at reliable, affordable, clean, we think about how that can work. It can work. It's difficult to accomplish, but if we do that, it'll be in the best interest of American consumers, American citizens, and also in the best interest of the American economy.
Well, since you're on the EPSA podcast, I couldn't possibly leave without asking you, what piece of advice or what thought would you leave with listeners on the value and the future of electric competition?
I love that question, Todd. Competition has served the American economy incredibly well, all across the board. Recently, I was traveling and I was taking an Uber to the airport, and I just got to talking to the driver. And it turns out that the driver was an immigrant from Cameroon. had participated in the lottery to be able to come to the United States. He'd gotten his green card, and then he had become a U.S. citizen. And I asked him, I said, why did you do that? Why did you come to the United States? Without a moment's hesitation, he said, America is the land of opportunity. You can make your life better. And he said, you can change your mind. You can decide, I was going to do that, but now I'm going to do something different. And I think in America and the United States, we forget that other people in the world do not have those opportunities, and they do not live in a land of opportunity. A big part of the reason we live in the land of opportunity is because we live in a world of competitive markets. Mm-hmm. And with competition, some of the time, that's a tough business, and it can be messy. But sometimes people get rich, sometimes they go bankrupt. But in the end, it makes the American economy dynamic, and it means that the consumers overall, American citizens in our American economy and our whole country are served well.
That's about as good a commercial for competitive markets as I can think of. So I'm going to give you a handful of rapid fire questions as we bring it to a close. What's one policy that you think would unleash investment tomorrow?
How about if I just say permit reform generally? We can make our permitting system much more efficient, much more responsive, and that would unleash capital, and it would improve the American economy and improve lives of consumers.
What's one risk that we're underestimating?
I'd go right back to where we started this podcast, and I would say uncertainty. I think the level of uncertainty we have about a number of different things in the economy and society today are very high. And I think we may be underestimating even the level of uncertainty that we have.
What's one overlooked opportunity?
In the power sector, I would say responsive demand. There are so many of us in the power business that think about supply of power, but I think responsive demand and ways that demand can respond to supply, to price, I think we haven't even scratched the surface of that. So I think it has great potential.
Interesting. What's one thing we need to say no to more often in energy policy?
That everybody can have everything that they want all the time. And again, because you have to optimize for reliability, affordability, environmental performance, but we do want to get them all and we need to optimize them. But some of the time we have to realize that it's a balance.
Yeah. What's one headline you hope to see in 5 years?
I would hope not to see a headline talking about energy prices or reliability.
And that is a great place for us to close. David Hill, thanks so much for joining us on Energy Solutions. We really appreciate your time and your input.
Thank you very much for having me, Todd. Greatly appreciate it.
That was David Hill bringing us a sharp, pragmatic look at how we plan for a future of rising electricity demand without repeating the mistakes of the past. Energy prices and affordability matter to everyone, no matter where they stand politically. As David explained, meeting rising demand while keeping costs down and avoiding overbuilding will require competitive market discipline and smart planning, and policy action like permitting reform to enable infrastructure growth. The current uncertainty in the energy sector poses a big challenge, but also a real opportunity to get this right. At EPSA, we believe that competitive electricity markets and private capital are the best tools to unlock the innovation and reliability we need, especially as AI, electrification, and new technologies reshape the power landscape. Thanks for listening. You can learn more about these issues on our website at epsa.org and follow us on social media on X at EPSA News and LinkedIn. The music for this podcast is produced by Let Me Hold That Ltd. Be sure to subscribe and join us next time on Energy Solutions.
Energy Solutions is brought to you by the Electric Power Supply Association. EPSA represents America's competitive power suppliers, which bring about 175,000 megawatts of power generation resources to customers throughout the United States. The music in this episode is written, produced, and performed by Let Me Hold That Ltd. Discover the power of competition at www.epsa.org.